You know, when we think about how the Nazis rose to power, one thing usually pops into our heads: the Great Depression. It's the story we all know, right? Economic collapse, mass unemployment, boom, extremism. But what if that's not the whole story? What if it's only half the picture? Some fascinating new research has dug way deeper into the data, and it's found a more precise and, frankly, more chilling explanation for what really went down.
I mean, the connection seems pretty straightforward. A massive economic crisis hits, and people, desperate for answers, turn to radical parties. But here's where researchers started to get curious. They started asking, well, which people exactly? Was it just everybody? Or was there a very specific group that acted as the tipping point? That's the question we're going to dig into.
So first, let's just set the scene. By 1933, an absolutely staggering 6.1 million Germans were out of work. That's about a third of the entire workforce. Just let that sink in. The Weimar Republic, Germany's brand new democracy, was completely on its knees. It just could not handle a crisis of this scale. And of course, this was the perfect fertile ground for extremist politics to take root.
And you can see the political fallout right here on this chart. It's just wild. In 1928, before the big crash, the Nazi Party was a tiny fringe group with just 12 seats in parliament, barely a blip. By 1930, whoa, that number explodes to 107. And by July of 1932, they were the single largest party with 230 seats. So yeah, the correlation with the crisis is undeniable. But as we're about to see, correlation isn't the whole story, not even close.
Okay, so to find the real story, we actually have to get out of the big industrial cities. The first big clue to this whole puzzle, it's out in the German countryside.
The image we all have in our heads is, unemployed factory workers lining up for bread in Berlin. But years before the Wall Street crash of 1929, a totally different economic disaster was already unfolding far away from the cities. And it's in this hidden crisis that we find one of the most important keys to the Nazis' rise.
The geography of the vote tells such a fascinating story. Check out this map from the November 1932 election. You can see right away that Nazi support wasn't just a blanket over the whole country. Look at these dark pockets of really intense support. A lot of them are in rural regions. This wasn't just some national wave, it was a series of local fires. Something very specific was happening out in the countryside.
And here's what it was. A global agricultural crisis hit Germany as early as 1925. Wheat prices completely collapsed. All these farmers who had taken out big loans to modernize their farms were suddenly drowning in debt. And to make things so much worse, the Weimar government's response was, well, terrible. They brought in tariffs and aid programs, but they were almost all designed to help the powerful, wealthy owners of gigantic estates out in eastern Germany. The small and medium-sized commercial farmers, they got pretty much nothing. They felt completely and totally abandoned, betrayed even, by the establishment.
And this feeling of being forgotten, this is where the story gets really specific. Researchers went back to the original census data from the 1920s and 30s, and by looking at it in a totally new way, they found the exact group that became the tipping point.
See, for the longest time, historians and sociologists just kind of lumped all agricultural workers together. They treated them as one big voting bloc. But this new analysis realized that was a huge mistake. The crucial factor, the one variable that unlocked the whole puzzle, was the size of the farm. A farmer with a tiny little plot just to feed his family had totally different problems and interests than a farmer who was running a real commercial business.
So meet the key demographic, the middle peasantry. These folks weren't dirt-poor subsistence farmers, and they weren't wealthy landowners with huge estates. They were in the middle. They owned commercial farms, somewhere around 12 to 50 acres. They sold their crops on the market, they often hired laborers, and this made them incredibly vulnerable to that price collapse. They were deeply, deeply angry about government policies that they saw as totally unfair. And the data just proves how different these farmers were. When you look at the statistical link between the smallest parcel farmers and these middle farmers, the correlation is almost zero. It means these two groups were fundamentally different. And as it turns out, they voted in completely different ways.
So, here it is, the big breakthrough. Just lumping all farmers together was hiding the most important pattern in the data. Once you isolate this one specific group, this economically squeezed, forgotten middle peasantry, their massive shift over to the Nazi Party comes into crystal clear focus. They were, in effect, the key swing voters in the total collapse of the Weimar Republic.
Okay, so if this group was the key, how did the Nazis win them over so effectively? Well, let me tell you, it was no accident. It was a calculated, incredibly targeted campaign.
The Nazis basically ran a brilliant four-part playbook. First, they actually listened. They went out and identified the specific anxieties and fears of these farmers. Then, they addressed a huge fear. Their original party platform actually called for seizing private land. Hitler personally stepped in and clarified this, promising it would never apply to them. Next, in March 1930, they proposed their own detailed program to save German agriculture, offering a concrete solution when the mainstream parties seemed to have none. And finally, their propaganda relentlessly, tirelessly pushed Hitler as the only strong leader who could step in and fix the whole mess. But it gets even more complex. It wasn't just economics and clever propaganda. The researchers found another powerful force at play here, something that supercharged the Nazis' appeal to this exact group. Because it turns out, not all of these middle peasants were equally susceptible to the Nazi message. The data revealed a really clear dividing line running straight through the German countryside. And that line was religion.
Now, this chart might look a little complicated, but what it shows is incredible. It reveals what researchers call the Protestant effect. Basically, that line shows the connection between middle farmers and the Nazi vote. As you move from left to right on the chart, as the percentage of Protestants in a region goes up, that link, that connection to the Nazi party, gets much, much stronger. Religion was like an amplifier for their message in the countryside.
So, why Protestants? Well, the key difference was political. German Catholics had a very strong political home, the Center Party. It was a powerful institution that acted as a sort of buffer against extremism. Protestant farmers, on the other hand, watched their traditional conservative parties completely fall apart during the crisis. This left them politically homeless and, as the researchers put it, socially disintegrated, which made them far more open to a radical new movement that promised to be their savior. So let's put it all together, a very specific economic group whose anxieties were amplified by a specific religious context. Why is it so important to understand this level of detail about something that happened almost a century ago? Because the underlying mechanism, well, it's timeless.
Decades ago, the sociologist Juan Linz identified this exact dynamic. He pointed out that the group most vulnerable to fascism wasn't the poorest of the poor or the richest of the rich. It was these proprietors of farmer capitalist agricultural enterprises. In other words, people running a business, people deeply tied to the market, and therefore people who are deeply, deeply sensitive when that market turns against them, and the political system seems to offer no help.
This reveals the timeless pattern. It's not just about the economy in some vague sense. It's about a specific group whose entire economic identity comes under threat, who feels completely abandoned and ignored by the political establishment, and who then becomes a prime target for a radical leader with simple answers and big promises. And that pattern is not confined to history.
And that really leaves us with a final, vital question. The story of Germany's middle peasantry isn't just about the past. It's a stark reminder to always ask, in any society, during any crisis, who are the people who feel left behind? And who is offering them a way out?